Somewhere in the Taklamakan Desert in western China, in a place whose name translates from the Old Turkic as "you go in and you do not come out," a series of graves were opened across the middle decades of the 20th century that should have been impossible. The desert had preserved the bodies inside them with such completeness that the skin was still intact, the hair still attached, the clothing still draped across the limbs the way it had been arranged at burial more than 3,000 years ago. The archaeologists who opened the graves documented everything carefully. The height of the bodies, taller than the surrounding populations by several inches. The color of the hair, in multiple cases, distinctly reddish or blonde. The facial structure, deep-set eyes, prominent noses, features that the researchers who first examined them described in their field notes with words that had no business appearing in an archaeological report from the middle of China. These were not the faces of an East Asian population. These were not the faces of anyone who should have been in the Taklamakan Desert in 2000 BC. The textbooks will tell you the story was solved. Western scholars propose that these mummies were early Indo-European migrants, waves of steppe pastoralists pushing east from the grasslands of Central Asia, distant relatives of the populations that had simultaneously reshaped Europe and South Asia. For decades, that was the settled answer. Mysterious, certainly, anomalous, obviously, but explicable within the framework of the Bronze Age migration patterns that ancient DNA had already documented across the rest of Eurasia. Then, a study was published in the journal Nature that the Chinese government had spent years delaying. The ancient DNA from the oldest mummies came back, and it did not match the steppe hypothesis at all. The mummies were not who the Western researchers had said they were. They were not who the Uyghur activists who had claimed them as ancestors said they were. They were not who anyone had said they were. Their genome pointed to a population so ancient, so isolated, and so thoroughly erased from every other part of the world that geneticists can only describe it using a term reserved for the most spectral findings in the entire field. And more unsettling than anything else, the reason it took this long to find out is not a mystery of science. It is a documented story of governments, politics, and the specific uses to which dead bodies can be put when the living cannot agree on who owns the past. To understand what the DNA overturned, you have to first understand what was at stake in the ground before a single bone was sequenced. And that means going back to the desert itself, which is one of the most extreme environments on Earth, and the reason any of this evidence survived long enough to be found. The Taklamakan Desert occupies the center of the Tarim Basin, a vast enclosed depression in what is now the Xinjiang region of far western China. It is surrounded on three sides by mountain ranges of extraordinary height: the Tian Shan to the north, the Pamir Plateau to the west, the Kunlun Mountains, and the Tibetan Plateau to the south. These ranges trap moisture coming from the west and prevent the monsoon from reaching from the east, producing a rain shadow of such completeness that the Taklamakan receives almost no precipitation at all. Average annual rainfall in the basin center is less than 10 millimeters. The sand dunes at the desert's heart are among the largest in the world. The summer temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The winter temperatures fall below minus 20. It is, by most measures, among the least hospitable large-scale environments on the planet. And yet people have been living on its edges for at least 4,000 years. The reason is the rivers. Snowmelt from the surrounding mountains feeds a ring of streams that flow down into the basin floor and disappear into the sand. And along the margins of these streams, where the water table runs shallow enough to support agriculture, there have always been oases, small, fertile, isolated pockets of habitable land surrounded on all sides by a desert that kills anything that ventures too far from the water. The oasis settlements of the Tarim Basin became, in the historical period, the nodes of the Silk Road, the commercial and cultural corridor connecting China to Central Asia and the Mediterranean world. But the oases were inhabited long before the Silk Road was imagined. And the people who first settled them left a record so complete that it forced the entire field of Bronze Age studies to reconsider what it thought it knew about who was moving where in the ancient world. The first mummies were found not by archaeologists, but by explorers and fortune hunters in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during the period of intense geopolitical competition between the British and Russian empires known as the Great Game. Aurel Stein, a British-Hungarian archaeologist working for the Indian Survey, was the first Westerner to systematically document the ancient sites of the Tarim Basin in expeditions conducted between 1900 and 1916. He brought back thousands of artifacts, including fragments of manuscripts in the Tocharian language, an Indo-European tongue that had been entirely unknown to scholarship until those manuscripts appeared. The manuscripts were old enough and geographically isolated enough that linguists initially struggled to place Tocharian in any known branch of the Indo-European family. When they finally mapped its relationships to other languages, what emerged was one of the most easterly examples of the Indo-European language family ever documented, a language that was clearly related to Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, but had been spoken for centuries in oasis cities at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains in western China. The language and the mummies arrived in scholarly consciousness together. And from the beginning, they implied the same question. How did people speaking an Indo-European language and apparently displaying non-East Asian physical features end up in the middle of Central Asia, buried in graves in a Chinese desert thousands of miles from anywhere the Indo-European languages had previously been documented? The physical features of the mummies are the detail that stops every person who encounters them for the first time. The Turken man, discovered at the site of Zaganluk in 1978, was a male individual approximately 6 feet tall, buried around 1000 BC with reddish-brown hair and a full beard, wearing a red twill tunic and tartan-patterned leggings. His tartan, the woven woolen plaid pattern covering his lower body, is structurally identical to the textile tradition independently associated in the popular imagination with Scotland. The textile was not from Scotland. It was woven in the Taklamakan Desert 3,000 years ago by a population whose relationship to the Scottish Highlands was, until the DNA arrived, entirely unknown. The beauty of Lulan is the mummy that appears in every documentary, every magazine article, every controversy about these remains. She was excavated near the dried lakebed of Lop Nor in 1980, dated to approximately 1800 BC, and preserved by the desert's desiccating cold, with a completeness that is almost uncomfortable to look at. Her hair is light brown with reddish tints. Her facial structure, studied by physical anthropologists from multiple countries, shows features inconsistent with the populations historically resident in the region. She was roughly 40 years old at death. She was wearing a wool garment and a felt hat. And her face, after 3,800 years in the ground, is recognizably individual. She looks like a specific person. That specificity, combined with the anomaly of her features in a Chinese desert, made her immediately political in ways that no mummy from the Valley of the Kings or the bogs of northern Europe had ever been. The Subeshi mummies, found at a site near Turpan and dating to around 500 to 300 BC, added a further dimension. Several of the female individuals in this group were buried wearing tall, distinctly pointed black felt hats, a style that researchers have compared to the conical hats associated with witches in European folk tradition, and to the headgear of certain Central Asian nomadic cultures. The hats were real, not symbolic. The women were tall, their hair was reddish-brown, and the genetic question they posed was the same one that every set of Tarim Basin mummies posed to every researcher who looked at them. Where did these people come from? The answer that emerged from 2 decades of linguistic, archaeological, and initially limited genetic research pointed east and north. The Yamnaya hypothesis, which had already explained the demographic transformation of Bronze Age Europe and the spread of Indo-European languages into South Asia, was the obvious candidate for the Tarim Basin mummies as well. The Yamnaya were the cattle-herding steppe pastoralists of the Pontic-Caspian region, whose genomic signature, rich in Eastern European hunter-gatherer and Caucasus-related ancestry, had been found everywhere that Indo-European languages later appeared. They had moved west into Europe around 3000 BC. They had moved south into Iran and South Asia around 2000 BC. It was entirely plausible that a branch of the same population had moved east at roughly the same time, carrying their language and their textile traditions and their tall stature into the oases of the Tarim Basin. This hypothesis had the advantage of elegance. It connected the Tarim Basin anomaly to a migration pattern that was already well documented. It explained the Indo-European language. It explained some of the physical features. And it fit neatly inside the broader narrative of Bronze Age Eurasian population movement that ancient DNA research had been constructing across the 2010s. The problem was that no one had actually sequenced the oldest Tarim Basin mummies with sufficient resolution to test the hypothesis properly. The samples were in China. The Chinese government controlled access to them. And the Chinese government had reasons, which were not scientific, to be cautious about what the DNA might show. The political situation surrounding the Tarim Basin mummies is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of government interference with archaeological research in the modern era. And it requires direct explanation because it is inseparable from the story of why it took so long to get the genetic answer. The Tarim Basin sits within the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the westernmost territory of the People's Republic of China, and the homeland of the Uyghur people, a Turkic-speaking Muslim minority whose relationship with the Chinese state has been, to use the most restrained possible language, deeply troubled. The Uyghur independence movement has a long history, and the Tarim Basin mummies became, from the moment they entered wider public awareness in the 1990s, a political instrument in the argument about who belongs in Xinjiang. Uyghur activists and some Uyghur scholars argued that the mummies demonstrated an ancient Western presence in the Tarim Basin that predated Han Chinese settlement by millennia, supporting the argument for Uyghur ancestral claims to the region. Han Chinese nationalists countered that the mummies were simply early examples of the diverse populations that had always inhabited Chinese territory, with no implications for modern sovereignty claims. The Chinese government, navigating between these positions while simultaneously pursuing policies toward the Uyghur population that had attracted international condemnation, found itself holding ancient bones that had become propaganda tools for causes it did not wish to advance. Victor Mayer, a professor of Chinese language and literature at the University of Pennsylvania, who became the most prominent Western advocate for serious study of the Tarim Basin mummies, documented in interviews and academic publications the specific obstacles that researchers encountered when trying to access the remains. Requests for samples were delayed, denied, or subjected to bureaucratic processes that consumed years. The genetic studies that Western researchers proposed were not carried out because the samples were not provided. The mummies were displayed in the Xinjiang Museum in Urumqi behind glass, photographed extensively by tourists, reproduced in Chinese archaeology publications, and simultaneously protected from the specific analytical procedure that would have answered the central question about their origins. The situation persisted for decades. The mummies were known. The mystery was documented. The technology to resolve it existed from roughly 2010 onward. The samples did not come. Researchers working on Bronze Age Eurasian population genetics published landmark studies on European steppe populations, on South Asian ancestry, on the genetic history of populations across the entirety of Eurasia, and the Tarim Basin remained a blank spot in the map because the Chinese government had not released the bones. Then, in 2021, a study appeared in Nature. The authors included Chinese researchers from institutions inside China, which was the key to how it had finally become possible. The paper presented ancient genomic data from 18 individuals from the Tarim Basin, including some of the oldest samples ever extracted from the site. The results were not what the Yamnaya hypothesis had predicted. They were not what anyone had predicted. The Tarim Basin mummies did not show Yamnaya ancestry. They showed no significant steppe ancestry at all. They showed no meaningful ancestry from the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, the Bronze Age urban culture of Central Asia whose influence had spread across a wide arc of the region during the same period. They showed no ancestry from the early Iranian farmers who had shaped the population genetics of much of Western and Central Asia. What they showed, with a consistency across multiple individuals that ruled out sampling error, was something that the research team described using a precise technical term. The oldest Tarim Basin individuals were a genetically isolated population, descended primarily from ancient North Eurasians. Ancient North Eurasians, abbreviated ANE in the genetic literature, are one of the source populations that contributed ancestry to the Yamnaya and to most modern Eurasian populations. They are known primarily from a single genome, sequenced from a 24,000-year-old individual found at the site of Malta in Siberia, near Lake Baikal, and from a small number of other ancient samples from a similar time period and geographic range. The ANE were a Pleistocene Siberian population, hunters living at the edge of the Ice Age world, whose ancestry has been found in diluted form in populations across northern Eurasia and the Americas, but who, as a distinct population, had essentially ceased to exist as a recognizable genetic unit by the early Holocene, absorbed and diluted by mixing events that distributed their ancestry across the descendant groups that populated Eurasia in the post-glacial period. The oldest Tarim Basin mummies appeared to descend primarily from a population that had remained isolated from these mixing events and had preserved the ANE genetic signature in a form not seen anywhere else in the ancient DNA record from the Bronze Age. They were, in the specific technical language of the paper, a remnant of an ancient Eurasian population that had experienced minimal gene flow for an extraordinarily long period of time. Their closest ancient genetic relatives were not the Yamnaya steppe herders from Ukraine. Their closest ancient genetic relatives were the Pleistocene Siberians of 20,000 years ago, preserved in genomic form in a desert at the edge of China, while every other population carrying similar ancestry had been mixed and diluted out of existence. The researchers described this population using a term that the field reserves for its most haunting findings. The Tarim Basin mummies, and the oldest and most isolated individuals in the sample, represented a ghost lineage, a population whose genetic profile indicated an ancestry that could not be fully accounted for by any known source population in the ancient DNA record, an ancestry that had been isolated long enough and thoroughly enough to become genetically distinct from everything around it, and an ancestry that had been carrying this distinctiveness through thousands of years of the Bronze Age world, sitting in oasis cities along what would eventually become the Silk Road, speaking an Indo-European language whose origin in their genome was now itself a mystery, requiring its own explanation. Because the language question became, after the DNA result, significantly more complicated than it had been before. The Yamnaya hypothesis had explained the Tocharian language by the same mechanism that explained Latin and Sanskrit. Indo-European languages spread with the steppe migration. The steppe migration reached the Tarim Basin. The Tocharian speakers were therefore descended from steppe migrants. The logic was clean. The DNA broke it. If the oldest Tarim Basin mummies showed no significant steppe ancestry, the language they spoke could not have arrived with the Yamnaya. It must have arrived some other way, through some other population movement, at some other time. The researchers proposed that the Indo-European language family, rather than being carried to the Tarim Basin by a later steppe migration, may have been acquired by the ANE-descended population through contact with groups carrying it, possibly during an earlier period of interaction that left a linguistic trace without leaving a substantial genetic one. This scenario is paralleled in other documented cases of language shift without genetic replacement, though the specific mechanism in the Tarim Basin case remains actively debated. The alternative possibility, which some researchers have proposed and which the data cannot entirely rule out, is that the ANE-descended population may have been among the carriers of an early form of the Indo-European language family before the Yamnaya expansion, representing a different and older branch of the Proto-Indo-European family tree than the one that produced the better documented Bronze Age migrations. In this reading, Tocharian is not the easternmost outlier of the Yamnaya expansion. It is a survival from an earlier phase of Indo-European dispersal that the Tarim Basin's isolation preserved when every other example of that early phase was absorbed into the later migrations. Either way, the mummies are older than the story that was told about them. Their isolation is older. Their ancestry is older, and the specific combination of physical features, tall stature, light hair, deep-set eyes, that made them so startling to the researchers who first opened the graves, reflects not a population that wandered in from the Ukrainian steppe in the Bronze Age, but a population whose ancestors had been accumulating a distinct genetic identity in the isolation of northern Eurasia since the Pleistocene. The physical features themselves, when read against the genomic background, tell a different story than the one the Yamnaya hypothesis had implied. The light hair and relatively pale pigmentation of many Tarim Basin individuals are consistent with the ANE genetic background, which carries variants associated with reduced pigmentation at frequencies higher than those seen in the populations that replaced them in most of Eurasia. The tall stature is consistent with the body proportions associated with cold-adapted Pleistocene populations. These are not features that arrived with a Bronze Age steppe migration. They are features that were present in the founding population and maintained across thousands of years of isolation from the mixing events that would have diluted them in any population with more external contact. The textile tradition presents its own dimension of the puzzle. The wool garments, the tartan-patterned fabrics, the felt hats found in the Tarim Basin burials represent a textile technology that was widespread across Eurasian populations in the Bronze Age, and that traveled with both people and trade networks rather than being uniquely associated with any single genetic group. The fact that Church and Man's leggings show a woven pattern structurally similar to Celtic tartans is a reflection of shared textile technology across Bronze Age Eurasia, not of direct ancestry from the populations of northwestern Europe. The technology was in the broader cultural network. The man wearing it was from a genetic background that predated that network by thousands of years. The political implications of the 2021 result were neither what the Uyghur activists had hoped for, nor what the Chinese state had feared. The mummies were not shown to be the ancestors of the modern Uyghur population, which is Turkic-speaking, and carries a genetic profile that reflects a different and more recent set of population movements through the region. The Uyghur claim to the mummies as direct biological ancestors was not supported by the DNA. But neither was the Chinese nationalist framing of the mummies as straightforwardly part of the diverse historical Chinese population. The mummies showed no significant ancestry from any of the populations associated with historical China. They were something else entirely, something older and stranger and more isolated than any of the political claims had anticipated. The study's authors, writing in a Chinese journal for a Chinese government-connected research infrastructure, were careful in their framing. The conclusion was presented as establishing the independence of the Tarim Basin population from any of the groups making contemporary territorial or ancestral claims. The mummies belonged to no one's nationalist narrative because they predated every nationalist narrative by several millennia. They were the remnant of a population that had been isolated in its desert oases since before the ancestors of any modern group in the region had arrived. This framing served the Chinese government's immediate interests in neutralizing the mummies as a political instrument for Uyghur advocacy, but it simultaneously produced a finding that is scientifically extraordinary in ways that extend far beyond the politics of Xinjiang. Because what the study documented, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of its political function, is one of the most remarkable cases of prehistoric genetic isolation ever identified in the ancient DNA record. The Tarim Basin ANE-descended population maintained its genetic distinctiveness across a period of at least 1,000 years, during which the Bronze Age world around it was being dramatically reshaped by migrations, trade networks, and population mixing events of enormous scale. To the west, the Yamnaya expansion was transforming the gene pools of Europe and South Asia. To the east, the populations of the Yellow River Valley were developing the cultural and demographic foundations of Chinese civilization. To the north and northwest, the steppe populations that would eventually produce the Iron Age nomadic empires were beginning their own demographic expansions. The Tarim Basin oases sat in the middle of all of this, apparently connected to the wider Eurasian world through trade, documented in the luxury goods found in the mummy burials, while remaining genetically sealed from it in a way that the surrounding geography both explains and does not fully account for. The Taklamakan is a formidable barrier, but not an impenetrable one. The oasis populations of the Bronze Age Tarim Basin were clearly in contact with the wider world. The goods in their graves traveled from far away. The wool technology was shared. The language, whatever its specific origin, was Indo-European. Contact existed. Gene flow, by the evidence of the oldest samples, did not. The population maintained its isolation not through geographic impossibility, but through a pattern of endogamy, marriage within the group, that the genetic data records as a near absence of external ancestry contributions across multiple generations of sampled individuals. This is the behavior of a population that chose its isolation, or that maintained it through social practices that limited marriage outside the group. In the ethnographic record of isolated populations that have maintained genetic distinctiveness into the modern era, including the Sardinians who preserve Neolithic European ancestry, the Basques who preserve pre-Indo-European ancestry in both language and genome, and the Aboriginal Australians, who preserve the deepest continuous human presence in any inhabited region on Earth, the pattern is consistent. Geographic isolation is a contributing factor, but not the sole one. Social practice, the decision about who is an eligible marriage partner, does more to maintain genetic distinctiveness than geography alone can accomplish. The Tarim Basin mummies were not simply trapped in a desert. They were a community that had organized itself in a way that preserved its genetic heritage across centuries of contact with a world that was changing dramatically around them. And when that contact eventually became incorporation, when the Tocharian-speaking oasis cities of the late 1st millennium AD were absorbed into the expanding Turkic cultural sphere, following the collapse of the Tang-era protectorate over Central Asia, the last carriers of that ancient genetic heritage were finally mixed into the populations that replaced them. The Tocharian languages disappeared from the historical record in the 9th and 10th centuries AD. The last manuscripts in the script were written by populations that were already showing evidence of the Turkic cultural transition. The language died not because the people died, but because the people were absorbed, linguistically and eventually genetically, into the Turkic-speaking populations whose expansion reshaped Central Asia across the 1st millennium AD. The genetic signal of the ancient Tarim Basin population, the ANE-derived ghost lineage that the 2021 study documented in the Bronze Age samples, is present in diluted form in some modern Central Asian populations, a faint trace of something that was once a coherent and isolated genetic heritage, distributed by centuries of mixing into the background noise of the broader regional gene pool. The beauty of Lulan has been in a glass case in the Xinjiang Museum for 4 decades. Her hair is still the color it was in 1800 BC. Her face is still the face that made the researchers who opened her grave reach for descriptive language that had no business being in a Chinese archaeological report. For 40 years, the question of who she was sat unanswered because the samples that would answer it were not released. When they finally were, the answer was not what any of the people who had claimed her had expected. She was not a Proto-European. She was not a Uyghur ancestor. She was not a Han Chinese ancestor. She was the face of a population so ancient and so isolated that the nearest genetic parallel in the modern world is a 24,000-year-old Siberian hunter whose bones were found near Lake Baikal and who died 12,000 years before she was born. She is the last visible representative of a genetic heritage that had been accumulating its distinctiveness since the Pleistocene. The desert preserved her face. The desert preserved her hair and her clothing and the felt hat beside her head. And across 4,000 years of history that included the rise and fall of every civilization anyone has ever heard of, the desert held the secret of who she was until a laboratory in China finally ran the test that the desert had been waiting all that time to confirm. The ghost lineage did not come from Europe. It did not come from the steppe. It came from a time before either of those categories had meaning. It came from the Ice Age world of northern Eurasia, preserved in oasis isolation, while the rest of the ancient world mixed and moved and became the populations we recognize from history. And it is gone now, absorbed into the Turkic world that replaced it, leaving no single community that carries it at depth, leaving only the mummies in their glass cases and the dry pages of Tocharian manuscripts that no one read for 1,000 years and the genetic data that a government spent decades trying not to release. Return to the graves, the Taklamakan Desert, the sand that preserved everything and revealed nothing for 4,000 years, the tall bodies with their wool garments and their tartan leggings and their felt hats, lying exactly as they were arranged on the day they were buried, waiting for a technology that would not exist for 3,800 years to finally answer the question, that their faces had been asking from the moment the first archaeologists looked at them. The textbooks said they were Bronze Age migrants from the steppe. The DNA said they were something older and stranger and more isolated than that. The government said they belonged to no one's story. The genome says they belong to a story that began at the edge of the Ice Age world and ended in a desert in western China, and that the closest living window into what they were is a genome sequenced from a Siberian grave that is 24,000 years old. The mystery of the Tarim Basin mummies was never really where they came from. It was why it took this long to ask the question without a government deciding in advance what the answer was allowed to be. The bones knew the whole time. They were just waiting for someone to let them speak.